the House on the latest situation regarding Russia's actions towards Ukraine. As at 900 hours today, there are now more than 110 battalion tactical groups massed around Ukraine's borders with Russia and Belarus. In addition, in the Black Sea Fleet, there are 2 amphibious groups, 9 cruise missile-equipped Russian ships, and a further 4 cruise missile-capable vessels in the Caspian Sea. In the last 48 hours, contrary to Kremlin assurances, we have seen a continued increase in troop numbers and a change in force disposition, moving from holding areas to potential launch locations. All the indicators point to increasing numbers and readiness of Russian forces. And, not surprising to many of us, the pledge to withdraw Russian troops from Belarus at the end of their joint military drills on the 20th of February was not carried out, and the exercise has now been extended until further notice. Complementing this troop build-up has been the proliferation of false flag operations, propaganda stunts, and Russian news outlets carrying fictitious allegations. These are not the actions of a Russian government fulfilling its repeated declarations that it has no intention of invading Ukraine. In fact, we have seen over the last few weeks the Russian playbook being implemented in a way that gives a strong cause for concern that President Putin is still committed to an invasion. I believe he is in danger of setting himself on a tragic course of events leading to a humanitarian crisis, instability, and widespread suffering, not just of Ukrainians, but also of the Russian people. Russians, like many of us, know the consequences of military interventions. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the First War in Chechnya. These are just 2 of the examples that Russia faced where too many young men returned home in zinc-lined coffins. And the government therefore urges President Putin, for the sake of his own people and even at this 11th hour, to rule out the invasion of Ukraine and recommit to a diplomatic process for us to address the perceptions of the Kremlin. Over recent weeks, my Right Honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, and I have engaged in numerous engagements with our international counterparts, including my own visit to Moscow to meet with Defence Minister Shoigu and General Valery Gerasimov. We have made clear our determination to uphold the defensive principles of NATO and to defend the right of sovereign countries to make choices about their own security arrangements. As the Russian government itself has signed up to, states, and I quote, have an equal right to security. We reaffirm the inherent right of each and every participating state to be free to choose or change its security arrangements, including treaties or alliances. That statement, Mr. Speaker, was signed by the Russians in 1975 in the Helsinki Final Act, in 1995 in the Budapest Summit Declaration, in 1999 in the Istanbul Summit, and most lately in 2010 at the Astana Summit. We urge Russia to stick to its commitments that it has openly made and signed up to over the years. My counterpart, Minister Shoigu, repeated to me in person that Russia has no intention of invading Ukraine, and while we will take them at their word, we must judge them by their actions. At our meeting, I also took the opportunity to address the proposals in Russia's draft treaty, because while this is not a return to normal UK relations, it is important that as one of Europe's biggest military powers, the UK maintains strong lines of communications with Russia in order to avoid miscalculation or the risk of inadvertent escalations. I also continue to speak regularly to my Ukrainian defence counterpart, Minister Reznikov, as we continue to support the armed forces of Ukraine. Since 2015, the UK has responded alongside the likes of Sweden and Canada to Russia's previous illegal occupation of Crimea with defence capability building, including training and reform. And as I announced to the House last month, Mr. Speaker, we took the decision to also provide lethal aid to Ukraine. This now means that alongside the United States, Canada, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania and the Netherlands, the United Kingdom has not just spoken but acted. I'm pleased with the efforts being made by a range of European leaders, including President Macron, to find a way through, as we must remain resolute in our commitment to NATO's formal response to the Russian draft treaties, which all NATO members signed up to. Intimidation and aggression, however, must not be rewarded. We should be under no illusion. The Russian forces have now massed on Ukraine's borders 65% of all their land combat power. The formation present and the action of the Russian state to date not only threaten the integrity of a sovereign state, but undermine international law and the democratic values in which all of us in Europe so strongly believe. The Foreign Office has now relocated the embassy further west in the country, and as 2 weeks ago advised all UK nationals should leave Ukraine via all means possible. The Ministry of Defence will continue to monitor Russian actions, support Ukrainian defensive efforts and contribute to NATO's response measures. We continue to hope, Mr. Speaker, President Putin will relent and pull back from an invasion, but we must prepare ourselves for the consequences if he does not. I will update the House as I have done so over the last few weeks, both in the Chamber and to colleagues online. Thank you.
Now come to Shadow Secretary of State, John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Defence Secretary has been busy in recent weeks, so I welcome his statement today. Can I also thank him for keeping the opposition parties updated on Ukraine during these very grave escalations of Russian military threats on the Ukrainian border. This is the most serious security crisis Europe has faced since the Cold War, and the Ukrainian people, citizens of a proud, independent and democratic country, face an utterly unprecedented threat from, as the Secretary has said, 2/3 of Russia's entire forces built up now on its borders. Mr. Speaker, there is unified UK political support for Ukraine's sovereignty and its territorial integrity in the face of this continuing Russian aggression. The government also has Labour's full support in helping Ukraine defend itself and in pursuing diplomacy, even at this 11th hour, and even though President Putin has proved more interested in disinformation than diplomacy. And we also fully support moves to reinforce the security of NATO allies, as the Labour leader and I told the Secretary-General at NATO HQ earlier this month. Mr. Speaker, President Putin wants to divide and weaken the West, to turn back the clock and re-establish Russian control over neighbouring countries. The real threat to President Putin and his Russian elites is Ukraine as a successful democracy, choosing for itself its trading and security links with the West. An attack on Ukraine is an attack on democracy. So we welcome the message from Munich at the weekend that any invasion will be met with massive sanctions in a swift, unified Western response. The European Union, of course, will lead on sanctions legislation for most European allies, especially to clamp down on finances or critical technologies for Russia. So how is the UK coordinating with the European Commission and Council? What meetings have UK ministers had to discuss this coordination? Mr. Speaker, the other message from Munich at the weekend was that allies stand ready for further talks, and the Defence Secretary has said this afternoon, I am pleased with the efforts being made by a range of European leaders, including President Macron. But what diplomatic initiatives is our UK Prime Minister taking, befitting Britain as a leading member of the NATO alliance and a permanent member of the UN Security Council? With the most serious tensions and developments in the Donbass, why did the UK government remove UK staff from the OSCE monitoring mission there, when those from all other European countries have stayed to do a job which is more vital now than ever? The Defence Secretary said quite rightly, we continue to support Ukrainian defensive efforts, including with lethal aid. So what more will the Defence Secretary now do with NATO to help Ukraine defend itself? Can he speed up action via the Ukraine naval agreement? How feasible is a no-fly zone? What consideration will he give to support for Ukrainian resistance? Mr. Speaker, we cannot stand up to Russian aggression abroad while accepting Russian corruption at home. For too long, Britain has been the destination for the dirty money that keeps Putin in power. So where is the economic crime bill, promised by the government and then pulled? Where is the comprehensive reform of Companies House? Where is the law to register foreign agents? Where is the Register of Overseas Entities Bill? Where is the replacement for the outdated Computer Misuse Act? Where are the new rules on political donations? Why does the government's elections bill make these problems worse by enabling political donations from donors based overseas? Whether or not President Putin invades Ukraine, Russia's long-run pattern of aggression demands a NATO response. So can the Secretary of State report from his meeting last week with NATO defence ministers on how the alliance's overall posture is set to change? Can he explain what could be taken to better coordinate NATO with the Joint Expeditionary Force, for instance, creating a regional readiness force? And finally, does Ukraine not expose the flaws in the government's integrated review last year, with its first focus on the Indo-Pacific and with its plan to cut the British Army by another 10,000 soldiers? Will he now halt any further army cuts, and will he restore the highest defence priority to Europe, the North Atlantic and the Arctic?
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman's support, and he will know that throughout this process we are grateful to the government, but also efforts to be united across this House has been one of the strongest messages we can send to Russia, as is we are united across NATO and indeed the EU to make sure that their behaviour is unacceptable. When the Right Honourable Gentleman asked about sanctions, my Right Honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has been in conversation more than weekly with the EU on coordinating sanctions to make sure the EU Commission, who is obviously the lead on their sanctions, the United States and the United Kingdom are as close as possible in lockstep. The EU have obviously currently taken the position that they will prepare and deliver the sanctions should an invasion happen at that moment. The United States and certainly the United Kingdom has laid before this House their sanctions that they would put in place. That is a difference of approach. However, we know from our own experience that the EU can move very quickly at a Commission level when it wishes to do so. And there is no loss of appetite or lack of appetite in the EU to deal with President Putin through sanctions should he make the tragic error of invading Ukraine. And I don't think anyone should play into the differences of timing to suggest that. It is just a simple mechanism of approach. My Right Honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, also through a group called the Quint++, that is the US, UK, Italy, France and Germany, plus NATO and the EU, are all working together on those type of responses, and they are regularly having discussions. On the issue of OSCE, I can get the exact, I will write to the Right Honourable Gentleman about it, but I know that one individual has been in touch. He is obviously a UK citizen, and when the Foreign Office advice was issued, there are certain, obviously, advices to citizens of our country, and if you find yourself in any organisation, obviously, that is our advice to them. However, other members of the OSCE have left, not all of them, but I will get him the full details as well. When it comes to the bigger questions of issues like aid, Ukrainian resistance and further support, he will know that it has been best pursued in a bilateral basis between countries or groupings of countries, such as through lethal aid. There's been much made of the fact that countries such as Germany and France have not done lethal aid to Ukraine. I simply reflect, as I did at NATO last week, that the strength of an alliance of 30 is we can all play to our strengths. That is important that we recognise that not every country in their political systems or their political leadership is going to have the same view, but as an alliance of 30, we can play to our strengths and we can deliver to Ukraine what it needs. And we've seen, for example, an increase in aid to Ukraine from the likes of Germany, as well as medical supplies. And in other countries such as the United Kingdom and the Baltic states, obviously lethal aid plays a part of that. And I think that's really important, Mr. Speaker, in order to keep going together at the same speed. We recognise that if we're going to tackle Russia, we have to be able to play to that strength. The EU has a strong role to play in helping the resilience of neighbouring countries, such as through migrant flows in Belarus, etc. If 1 million refugees appear in Hungary or Romania or Poland, I would urge the EU needs to step up and think about what it's going to do about millions of refugees on their soil, rather than think about it afterwards. And I think that's where the EU Commission can play a strong role in resilience building. In other areas, his comments on the integrated review. Look, I actually think it's the opposite. If you read the full integrated review and the Defence Command paper, what it showed was we have to be ready. And what it shows is that Russia and adversaries like Russia, they don't go with a big bang and just arrive in a big invasion. They soften up their targets using sub-threshold methods in cyber, in corruption, in organised crime, etc. And they turn up incrementally. Many of the forces that we see now massed on Ukraine's border were in fact pre-positioned in April following an exercise, and then their troops went home to barracks. That allowed them to be ready and to deploy in days, while NATO's traditional model has been weeks and months for us to deploy. That's why in our Defence Command paper we put a premium on speed and readiness, and if sometimes that premium means a less mass, that's why we have an alliance to pick up on that. We have an alliance of 30 countries. We way outspend Russia collectively as a group of nations and indeed capabilities, and it's why I'm now able to offer our NATO leaders true forces that will actually turn up on the day, rather than what we had even in my day when I was serving in West Germany or North Germany, which was fictional numbers, but actually when you press the button, instead of a division, you got a brigade. And I think that is far more important to show strength to the Russians that we mean what we say and we can deliver on that. I was Security Minister, Mr. Speaker, when I introduced the Criminals Finance Act. There was no more greater champion on taking down dirty money in the city than me. I brought in the unexplained wealth orders. I brought in the mobile stores of wealth where people got round it, and in fact helped set up the national, within the National Crime Agency, the Economic Crime Unit. I also made sure that we changed the law around tax evasion to make sure we got more people, and pushed incredibly hard and successfully through the, I think it was the G7, the Transparent Register of Beneficial Ownership. He's absolutely right, we need to do more. I absolutely supported at the time, and still do, a register of foreign agents, and I am, the whole of government is now looking at those issues, and I think he is totally right around areas like Companies House. The government is committed to do something about it. I expect an announcement soon on a range of those issues, but he's right that the consequences of Russia's action, going way back to Salisbury and before, is that we must stop the oligarchs and their dirty money resident in this country behaving as a place of refuge when in fact they should not be welcome. And if it comes to an invasion of Ukraine, Russia should know what it costs to be isolated.
Theresa May.
Speaker, can I commend my right honourable friend and the government for the robust stance which they have been taking alongside our American and European allies in the face of Russia's threats against Ukraine. President Putin wants to weaken NATO and the Western alliance, but does my right honourable friend agree with me that any further action to invade Ukrainian territory by the Russians can only lead to a strengthening of the determination of the UK, NATO and the Western alliance to defend the rights of sovereign states and to defend democracy?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right, and I have to say, when I was her security minister, it was her support that allowed us to sometimes overrule the Treasury to get some of those legislations through to deal with the Criminal Finances Act. My right honourable friend is absolutely right. In 2014, after the invasion of Crimea, President Putin got exactly the opposite of what he wanted. He got more forces on the east of Europe, he got more defence spending. If he continues down this line, I suspect he'll continue to get more forces on his border and greater defence spending across NATO, the very opposite of what he is trying to intend to do. I hope he learns a lesson of 2015. At the moment, it's not looking well. Good.
SNP spokesperson Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary for advance sight of the statement and the updates he's been giving opposition parties over the previous weeks, and underline that on these benches we are friends of Ukraine, we are supporters of international law, and we support absolutely Ukraine's right and ability to organise its security affairs as it sees fit. But as the Russian Security Council meeting happening as we've been sat in this chamber this afternoon shows us, we have reached a dangerous moment in all of this. The Secretary has mentioned the new sanctions package that was announced by the government just before the recess. And when that package was announced, it stated, quote, that it will give the government the ability to sanction entities and individuals of economic and strategic interest to Russia, but only if there is a further escalation. Well, that escalation has started, Mr. Speaker, and we saw that yesterday, Saturday and on Friday, anyone who was following events in the Donbass region. So isn't it time to start sanctioning individuals and entities of strategic interest now, including those here in this country. And given the importance that disinformation and the entire architecture that the Russian government has to spread disinformation to the conflict it's perpetrating against Ukraine, shouldn't that start with some of those disinformation rackets here, the likes of RT, Sputnik and others, now?
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right, and I think the new leader of Alba may like to reflect on his celebrity status on some of those channels. I think what I would say to the honourable gentleman is the government already does have some considerable powers. The Minsk sanctions that have been used against a number of Russian individuals after Salisbury. In fact, some of the people I met in the Russian Ministry of Defence themselves were sanctioned under a range of those measures, and we do continue to deliver them. But on the wider response, the whole of government will produce a response to this House in due course. I understand his point about should we not do sanctions now rather than wait for it to happen. I think the key here is that we have to be in a position to threaten to deliver sanctions against Russia if they do something. If we were to unilaterally deliver them now, and America wasn't and the European Union wasn't, I think there is a danger that President Putin would play into a divide and rule narrative that he is trying to do. I think that there are plenty of measures we can take. We are planning some serious set of sanctions, and I think that the reality and the question to President Putin is, do you actually care what's going to happen to your people? Because it will be them that suffers most as a result of the sanctions, and it will be interesting, as a responsible leader, whether he will listen to that.
The Select Committee, Tobias Selden.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, could I welcome this statement? The penny was dropping at the Munich Security Conference that this is not just about Ukraine, but a wider realignment of global power, with the formation of a new Russia-China alliance that is fueling Putin's adventurism and indeed perhaps taking us towards another Cold War. The money laundering issues aside, which must go ahead, absolutely, could I ask the Secretary of State to look at the issues of sanctions? Because there is a concern we are actually helping Putin in his intention of turning Russia away from the West and towards a new alliance with China in the long-term future.
If Russia wants to be dependent on China, then I think they will recognise that will be a wrong decision. China and Russia are directly in competition over the high north and the route through the Arctic, and Russia surely will not want to depend entirely on China in the same way many European states are regretting being entirely dependent on Russian gas. I think it's important, however, that we do a range of sanctions that not only are directed at the regime and the government of Russia, but also at some of their bankers or their people that help them carry on as normal.
Ben Bradshaw.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I fully support what the Defence Secretary said and the response of the Shadow Defence Secretary. But as the architect of unexplained wealth orders, he must share the widespread frustration that not a single one has been issued under the current Prime Minister. Not a single Russian who was given a golden visa has been named. Why does he think we've been so slow at tackling dirty Russian money in London?
Look, unexplained wealth orders are not a matter for politicians. They are a matter for the investigators, the National Crime Agency and economic crime. I can no more direct an unexplained wealth order than he can. Although when I was Security Minister, I was victim of a Russian fraud that tried to purport me having a conversation with the Russian Prosecutor General and directing them. So I am disappointed there are not as many as I had hoped. The legislation was taken through. They are a very powerful model. They have been used on some pretty unsavoury people, and I'm delighted they have been. But he is right, there are not enough to be used. We are quite unique in having them. There aren't many other countries, and we should do more. And I think we should understand why the NCA has not delivered as many as we had hoped. I think there are other tools to look at. I certainly welcome that long-term commitment on beneficial ownership. I think the Companies House legislation is something that we'll see soon. I remember being horrified to discover that pretty much even a sanctioned individual could open a company, because I don't even think in those days they were given an identity check. That has to stop. I know they've done some tightening up. It will take legislation, and I hope the whole House will support that.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I say to my right honourable friend, I recommend his calm and straightforward posture during the course of this, and I think he's done incredibly well. Can I also say to him this, though, that in the course of all of our debates and even on TV, we behave as though Russia is threatening to invade Ukraine. Russia has already invaded Ukraine. They took the Crimea, and they're right now furnishing the Donbass region with munitions to create even further trouble. So when we look at it like this, what worries me slightly is that lots of foreign leaders going over to see Mr. Putin, which is what he wants to do, and then we may just get this position where there's a little scintilla of a little question that says, well, maybe we won't let Ukraine in if they wanted to come into NATO. Maybe we'll make it clear that this is not something that they could get. Can I just get an absolute assurance from our honourable friend that the UK government believes that if the democratically elected government of the Ukraine wishes to do anything and asked to do it, they will be entertained no worse than any other country would do?
My right honourable friend makes a powerful point, and we should be true to our values. And the Prime Minister was very clear at Munich that the point he raises is absolutely the case. It is also the case that the NATO response to Russia, which was all 30 members, was very clear on that. We shall hold each other to that commitment, and I think it is absolutely right that now is the time to stand up and say these are our values, they are not up for compromise, we're not going to give a single inch, and fundamentally we are not going to reward a bully.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State said a moment ago, he talked about sanctions on Russia if they do something. Can I just press him on this point? We don't yet know for sure whether full invasion will take place, but can he tell the House what the government's response would be if the action taken by Russia, say, took the form of a no-fly zone over Ukraine, or blockading of its ports, or repeated and significant cyber attacks on Ukrainian institutions and governments? In those circumstances, would the government respond with the full sanctions that it's obviously been discussing?
I'm grateful to that, Honourable Member. First of all, let me make something clear, as he knows. There's lots of sanctions already in place after Crimea. So these are about additional sanctions on top of the raft of sanctions the government brought in after that illegal invasion and annexation of Crimea and indeed the Donbass. Look, I think he is absolutely right. Look, many of these aggressive moves, like a no-fly zone, in other words, the threatening of the integrity of that sovereign state, a blockade to free trade, would absolutely warrant a response ranging from sanctions and others. I think we would look at it at the time, but absolutely I agree with him. Be under no illusion, Russia should be under no illusion that threatening the integrity of a sovereign nation, whether that's in the air or on the sea, is exactly the same as threatening it on the land.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Following the first invasion in 2014, and in order to get round sanctions, Russia has had extensive import substitution and investment in European companies in critical infrastructure and energy, a policy of tolerance, if not appeasement, by European governments. Can I say to my right honourable friend, who I think has been an exemplary Defence Secretary through this crisis, that sanctions alone will not protect Ukraine from a subsequent Russian invasion. They need either substantial improvements in their defence capabilities or a security guarantee, or both. President Putin believes that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. There is no lack of clarity there, and ultimately he can only be deterred by the threatened use of force.
The government's taken a position, as have NATO, that it's about deterrence and diplomacy, and deterrence does involve the recognition that shoring up NATO members with resilience and containment measures to make sure that Russia is contained should it make that foolish mistake of invasion of Ukraine is upheld. That is done by our forces. That's why we've made available even more, including 1,000 members of the army on standby, currently in the UK, to send elsewhere. But I also think he is right that this, at the heart of this, is about defending Ukraine's right to choose. Not what it does with that right, but fundamentally a democratic nation has chosen something. We should respect that. And we are on the cusp of an invasion of a democratic country in Europe. That should worry us all.
Jamie Stone.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for an advanced copy of the statement. Now, let's be clear about this. If Russia invades Ukraine, there will quite rightly be massive sanctions placed on Russia. And if that happens, we can expect a salvo of cyber attacks on the United Kingdom. So I seek two reassurances from the Secretary of State. Firstly, that we have the best possible defences against cyber attacks, but also what is good for the goose is good for the gander. If necessary, we can use cyber warfare to give as good as we get back to Russia.
The Defence Command paper published last year set out plans to establish and grow to a significant size the National Cyber Force, which is the United Kingdom's offensive cyber capability to complement our defensive capability. That is a joint GCHQ and defence agency. It will be based in the northwest of England. It has already been established and starting to grow. I can't comment on the operations it will undertake. I'm a soldier. I was always taught the best part of defence is offence.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What will the government do to try and impress on President Putin that even if he invades the rest of the Ukraine without military comeback on behalf of Ukraine, it would be a fatal error for him then to think that he could invade an outlying NATO state, one of the Baltic states, for example, without an attack on one rightly being considered to be an attack on all NATO members?
President Putin's public stated view is that, in fact, by potentially dealing with Ukraine or preventing Ukraine joining NATO, he is in fact saving us all from a future war, because he wrongly asserts that should Ukraine join NATO, Ukraine would then attack Crimea and the Donbass, and that would trigger a NATO. My right honourable friend is absolutely an expert on NATO. He knows that it's just a fantasy scenario, but potentially used as a justification. And I think it's therefore very important we demonstrate that, yes, with Ukraine not being in NATO, we, however, can do our best to protect their right to choose, but also that we make sure it very, very crystal clear to the President of Russia that, try this with NATO partners, and no matter how big and how small, Article 5 is a reality.
Barry Sherman.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm particularly fearful of the possibility of an outbreak of war in Europe. I was born not far from here during the worst blitz of the war with Nazi Germany. And every time I think about war, I remember my family, my father away at war, bombs raining down, killing our neighbours. So no one can give me lectures on this. We must show these despots and dictators firmly that we mean business in every sense. Will he join me in sending that message to Putin?
And I've been very consistent, and like him, and like a number of my colleagues on this side of the House and on the front bench, and indeed some on your side, whether you have been born in a Second World War environment or you have seen people at the wrong end of a terrorist attack or death and destruction, no one comes here glowing with warmongering in their heart. They come here trying to do their very best to avoid it. But of course, we also know that freedom comes at a cost. Freedom is not free, as the South Koreans know and put on their war memorials. And we have to stand up to this, because we didn't stand up in 2014 as an international community. We didn't stand up as an international community enough. We did send a very successful and strong message after Salisbury poisoning, and 153 intelligence officers were expelled. But, the ripples of this being successful for President Putin will not end. They will go through us all, and we will all regret it in the long run. And sometimes that means taking a stand, and I think now's the time.
Bob Stewart.
Oh, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I understand that the Duma passed a resolution that the Donbass and the Crimea were to be incorporated into Russia. This in some way gives Putin some sort of legality if he was to think of invading. If Putin was to replace the so-called little green men in the Donbass with regular Russian soldiers, could we expect NATO and the West to respond with just as much severity when we're talking about sanctions as if he'd invaded the remainder of Ukraine?
Look, I think we have, as you say, put in a raft of sanctions already. I think Russian regulars have come and gone in Donbass already. They're already heavily based in Crimea to a significant number. They take it as their own. This latest Donbass, I think it's a resolution about the Donbass in the Duma, is of course worrying, and we should all recognise that this is effectively a motion over a sovereign state they have no legal international law authority over, and we should not recognise it. The Prime Minister has been very clear that 1 inch over the border on this incursion will lead to the sanctions. 1 boot, 1 tank, 1 vehicle, and we won't accept it as anything other than an invasion. It's not an interversion, it's not an incursion, it's an invasion, and we will stick to that line.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. At this incredibly dangerous time, I noticed that the Defence Secretary did not mention or say much about the Minsk agreement. Does he think this is a way that we can go back to further talks? And would he be prepared to countenance, if the Russians pull back, any reduction in the NATO presence on the border as well, in order to bring about a longer-term secure peace in the region?
So, the Right Honourable Gentleman raises the point about Minsk. I was very clear on Minsk, both in my press conference in Moscow and indeed elsewhere. Both Russia and Ukraine signed Minsk. He will know that in those type of treaties, such as we found with the Good Friday Agreement, the treaty is one thing. Rolling up your sleeves and delivering the sequences in the right way is the big challenge. We all remember that from things like decommissioning in Northern Ireland. Easy to write a Good Friday Agreement, hard to deliver. Same for the Minsk Agreement. But we all recognise that the Minsk Agreement is one of the ways through. It should be. We should do our best to support it being implemented as a way out. On his other point about pulling back NATO, we didn't put 165,000 combat troops on the edge of a sovereign country and hold a gun to the head of a democratically elected government. We didn't do that. Russia did that. We have nothing to de-escalate from. Russia does. And I do hope the Right Honourable Gentleman might condemn the Stop the War coalition, who seems to always paint us as the aggressor. Maybe he'd like to go and ask the people of Ukraine what he actually thinks who the aggressor is.
John Whittingdale.
Can my right friend say whether increased military activity has been detected in other Russian-controlled areas, such as Transnistria, as well as Crimea and Kaliningrad? And what assessment has he made of the possible threat, if not now, then in the future, against other former Soviet states which are outside of NATO, such as Moldova?
It's been a long-running challenge, Russia's malign activity. We've packaged it up and called it malign activity, but we have seen it in the likes of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and we should not forget in all of this that Bosnia-Herzegovina is on a very fragile position at the moment. It is in an impoverished state. The minorities are already starting to agitate, and Russia's influence into some of the separatists could have the potential of sending us all back to the early 90s. Russia's malign activity does no good, and it not only challenges our European values, but it also challenges both the wealth of those states, and for no apparent reason, it seems, other than to just weaken people who think differently from them.
Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I fear things have moved on yet further today. Mr. Medvedev has said 2 things which are very disturbing. First, that it will be perfectly possible to recognise the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk. And secondly, that, of course, there might be sanctions, but we'd be able to, or Russia will be able to wear it, because after all, after 2014, after the invasion of Crimea and after their military action in Georgia, they were able to wear whatever the West threw at them. Can he confirm that only 1/3 of those areas that I've just referred to are presently held by separatists? So recognising or trying to enforce some independence for those areas would mean a very significant invasion of Ukrainian territory, including areas that are not presently held by separatists at all. Secondly, that Ukrainians, if anything, are more determined now than ever to face towards the West because of precisely what President Putin has been doing over these years. And whatever comes, if there is an invasion of any kind, any troops, as he's already said, the reaction is going to have to be a damn sight harder than it was in 2014, isn't it?
Look, I think he's right on his last point. It absolutely has to be harder and unified and stick to it. I think often the calculation in Russia is we'll all get bored and 6 months later everything will go back to normal. On the sanctions point, Minister Shoigu said to my face that the sanctions can't harm them. they will just either go elsewhere or they're resilient. That is, unfortunately, the view in some of the leadership of the Russian government. I doubt it's the view of the Russian people that have to suffer the consequences of that. And I think we should also recognise the consequence for the wider world of this invasion. Yemen gets about 20% of its food from Ukrainian grain. Libya gets about 44% of its food from Ukrainian grain. What would happen to those countries with rising food prices, shortage of food, is a horrible consequence that we must do everything to avoid. This is a global problem. Ukraine matters. Our strength of resolve matters, because as he and I will know, there are other bigger countries looking at how much resolve we have to stand by our values.
Alicia Keynes.
Speaker. I'd like to thank the government and civil society organisations for all they're doing to expose false flag and disinformation efforts from the Kremlin. But Putin has just finished his extraordinary meeting of the Security Council, where again overwhelming support has been given to recognise the independence of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. Before he announces his plans tonight, will my right honourable friend please call this out for what it is, a dangerous precursor to the illegal annexation of these lands? And will he also confirm that despite our focus on preventing further invasion, we do not tacitly accept that those territories currently illegally held are rightly Russian?
We all accept that the 2014 invasion of the Donbass and Crimea was an invasion of a sovereign territory, and nothing changes that. And all our NATO allies agree on that entirely and have recognised not 1 inch of those lands, including, by the way, China has still not recognised the Donbass. That's an important message, I think, to President Putin. For all of our issues with China, I do not think wants an economic schism in the heart of Europe at this moment in time, and I think that is something that hopefully President Putin will rely on. Look, all of these plans, whether it is annexation of part of Ukraine, whether it is false flags of people having to be evacuated or Ukrainian attacks on things, they're all false. They're all designed to cause an excuse or a friction. The worrying thing is we can all see it. You don't have to be an expert in Europe to spot what's going on. The worry for us is that President Putin thinks that it doesn't matter or thinks that he can get away with it.
Kevin Jones.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Can I first of all commend the Defence Secretary for his actions over the last few months. He mentioned in his statement the Russian playbook, and one of it is to portray that somehow the false narrative around the sovereignty of the Ukraine. Is he confident enough that we in the West have an ability to push back against these false narratives, and particularly on social media, which seem to infect the debate which is currently taking place?
We certainly have the capability, and we do everything we can both internationally and indeed unilaterally to try and make sure the messages get not only across to our own audiences but also importantly to the Ukrainians and indeed the Russian audience. We could start close to home. We could ask the leader of Alba on his next Russia Today programme to do an in-depth analysis of exactly some of these false claims and broadcast it. I mean, I'm sure he's open to the highest bidder, so we'll be very happy to do that. But I think it's really important that we recognise in this era, information is as powerful as every tank, and we have to make sure that the people of Russia, the ordinary people of Russia and the people of Ukraine are not denied free and fair press in order to get across the message about what is going on in their country in their name.
Crispin Blunt.
In today's circumstances, what obligations does Her Majesty's Government feel it accepts under the Budapest Memorandum?
The Budapest Memorandum, as my right honourable friend will know, was an agreement to effectively for Ukraine to disarm its nuclear weapons in exchange for Russia's recognition of their sovereignty. If Russia breaches that, and you could argue it already has with its invasion, then I would guess that the memorandum, I'm not an international lawyer, but would become pretty much null and void. We are one of the, I think, signature guarantors of that, which is why we're doing so much now to hold them to account. And as I said in questions and in the statement, let us not forget, Russia, including, I think, Prime Minister or President Medvedev, whichever role he was filling, in 2010 at the Astana summit, signed up alongside the international community, to recognise that every participating state is free to choose or change its security arrangements, including treaties and alliances. That's what they signed up to then. Never mind these conspiracy theories that somebody somewhere said that NATO would never expand. We've never seen any proof of that. We've never seen any documents. What we have seen is at least 4 statements and treaties signed by Russia over the many years that says it respects the sovereignty of countries to choose. We hold them to it.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker. First of all, can I congratulate the Minister in the leading role which he has played in rallying the opposition to Russia's aggression towards the Ukraine. We already know that many European nations, of course, find it difficult because they have allowed themselves to be subject to energy blackmail through their zero-carbon policy. But Russian aggression against Ukraine threatens the strategic supplies of food in the world, because Ukraine is the 3rd biggest producer or exporter of grain at 100 million tonnes per year. What assessment has he done about the areas of the world which are most likely to be affected if aggression should lead to that food not being available? And does he not agree that it underlines the strategic importance of Ukraine and the importance of giving every support to allow them to defend their independence, their democracy and their vital economic role?
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right. It's not just about gas. I mean, we've focused on gas because predominantly it's what preoccupies us in our comfy part of Europe. But in many countries in the world, it's about food and it's about other cost of living crises, some of which are far more pressing about whether or not we can afford the potential increase of gas. And we should not forget this implication goes right across the world, certainly the Western world, if we don't deal with it and deter it. And I think it's very important. And, you know, the Prime Minister at Munich was absolutely clear with everyone, including the President of Ukraine, that we would stand by Ukraine, that we must be resolved together, both as Europe and as NATO. We mustn't salami slice ourselves away on different thoughts. And I know that when the Prime Minister speaks to his European counterparts, he is very much focused on this sense of unanimous and strong alliance challenging the assertion, because it is the case that if we don't deter today, we will all pay for it tomorrow.
Bill Wigan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for the work that he and the Prime Minister have done on this. Having visited Georgia and seen for myself what Russian incursions look like, if the Ukraine is invaded, will Georgia be admitted to NATO?
Well, look, it's for Georgia and its relationship with NATO and NATO collectively to recognise its decision, or whether it does exceed. Fundamentally, as the Prime Minister has been clear as he knows, that it is about maintaining the open door policy of Ukraine, of sovereign states. And I said to the Russians very clearly, you know, NATO doesn't go around choosing people. People choose NATO. They choose our values, and that's how it's done. There is no secret plot to go around undermining or dividing Russia. And the question for President Putin should be, why is it all those countries wanted to join NATO in the first place? It wasn't to collect a badge. It was because they felt under threat by a nation that did not want to respect their sovereignty and their democracy and their freedom.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement? The situation is clearly very grave, but he obviously has a pretty clear view of the situation on the ground. The wife of my constituent is stuck in Ukraine near the Russian border, and she can't complete a medical assessment or enrol biometrics to complete a spousal visa. And because he isn't in Ukraine, they can't use the family migration route. So what pressure can he bring to bear on the Home Office to ensure that if the situation escalates, as seems inevitable, our military aren't left to evacuate citizens and families?
Look, if my learned member just obviously sends me the details, I will be very, very happy to take it up and look at it for her.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Tonight, can I too commend my right honourable friend and the Minister for the fantastic job they're doing in very difficult circumstances. If Russia does invade, countries, NATO countries, particularly the smaller ones, particularly the Baltic countries, will need our reassurance. Does my right honourable friend foresee further deployments of British troops to these countries?
And if he does, would it not be hugely reassuring to him if he had 10,000 more troops in his back pocket?
Well, tonight, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are hosting the 10 nations of the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is the Nordic states, plus Iceland, plus Holland. We will be hosting them tonight and tomorrow at a summit, and I have invited from across the House colleagues from the Labour front bench, the Scottish National Party and the Liberal Democrats, because I think it is important that we recognise the importance they have to us as our allies, and they are the ones on that front line. He is right that they will be the ones most worried. They are, some of them, territories that President Putin and his like have often felt are not territories. And if you, as I've referred to colleagues before, if you look at President Putin's essay of July last year, of course, that is one of the consequences, I fear, of President Putin being successful in Ukraine, is where do the ripples land next? We will need forces to do that. We've been managing to double up that into a brigade. The enhanced forward presence, which are 4 battle groups that currently exist, multinational, I suspect they will grow, will be open to more suggestions.
Clive Efford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We should be moving against Russian dirty money in the City of London, regardless of what happens in Ukraine. And I don't doubt the Secretary of State's determination to deal with that as he's expressed it today. But the lack of activity suggests that there are others in government who do not share his determination. So can he assure us that should there be an invasion even tonight, that we are ready to take action against that dirty money?
Look, it won't have missed anyone in this House that we are all vulnerable to not only dirty money, but to illicit lobbying or influence by foreign agents. All of us in this House, we have to wake up to the threat of sub-threshold challenges, whether that's money, whether that's corruption, whether that's political interference. All of us. And I'm not going to throw stones in glass houses, but all of us on this side of the House and your side of the House know what that looks like. We have to have more transparency as the beginning of that process, and we have to enact some of the laws we already have. And I'll be very happy on his behalf to engage with the National Crime Agency to see what more we can do.
If we have shorter questions and therefore the Secretary of State can give shorter answers, we will be able to get everyone in this statement. If not, I'm afraid some people will be disappointed because, as you can see, people are coming in for the next item of business. But this is important, and I would like to give everybody the chance to speak. Shorter, please. Richard Graham.
Madam Deputy Speaker, when Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that sovereignty must be respected, and that includes Ukraine, does my right honourable friend believe that this will encourage President Putin to hold back? And should he still invade, what impact will that have on Sino-Russian relationships, and how concerned should we be for Taiwan?
My right honourable friend said, answer that in 5 words. I think it's a very important message from China to Russia, and he should listen to it. But of course, the most important message is that we demonstrate resolve about protecting our values, because whatever we don't or do in this part of the world, China is watching.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State is being slightly more gracious about the work of European leaders in trying to find a diplomatic solution, but just a week or so ago, he was saying that those efforts had a whiff of Munich about them. Does he want to apologise for that remark, which was not only crass, but it also undermines efforts to deliver Minsk II as the starting point for our best chance of avoiding war? And will he accept that if the government is serious about playing a constructive role, it should start by getting its own house in order, first of all by repaying the almost £2 million which his party has received in Russian donations since the Prime Minister took office, and will he finally end London's role in hiding the proceeds of Kremlin-connected corruption?
Look, the Honourable Lady, I'm sure the Honourable Lady understands what I meant when I said if President Putin invades Ukraine, there would be a whiff of Munich. Because, of course, Munich was 2 parts. It was the appeasement, but it was also the fact that all the way through Hitler lied and had a plan to aggressively invade large parts of Europe. And my point I was making was if he invaded, as I put in my own article, then we would be chasing a straw man when all along President Putin had a predetermined plan. So I suggest, before she makes those sort of allegations, that she goes back to the history books, understand what Munich was about, and then she'll understand what I was saying. Because what we do know here is that time and time again, President Putin has ignored international law, ignored human rights, invaded countries, murdered British people on these streets through his orders in the GRU, and all she can do here is come here, stand up and tell us that we're in the wrong. Maybe she should go to Moscow and tell it themselves.
John Barron.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know my right honourable friend will agree. That George war is preferable to war. But does he accept that given Russian ambitions regarding Ukraine and events elsewhere, including the South China Sea, that the time has come finally for the UK to accept that we need to substantially increase our defence spending on a sustainable long-term basis, because George war is far more effective if you've got a strong armed forces?
The Prime Minister supported and delivered the biggest increase in defence spending since the Cold War. The £24 billion extra was also to modernise our armed forces, as well as to make sure we were able to enter new domains where we are threatened by both Russia and other adversaries. That is the right track. We've always been consistent, as has the Prime Minister, which is fundamentally, if the threat changes, we should always be open to review. I think that's important. We should also recognise that we achieve our strength in the West through our alliances on our values and alliances on our defence spending. NATO is the best alliance for that. It is the keystone of European security. Our spending outstrips Russia, and our forces do as well. The only thing that we must make sure we continue is resolve. Resolve is what this crisis is about. We're resolved, the Prime Minister is resolved, the United Kingdom's resolved. We're going to stand up for our values against Putin's aggression.
Dave Dugan.
Deputy Speaker, from a logistical perspective, what efforts are being made to ramp up the provision of the Ukrainian military's specific requests for additional equipment and parts from the Ministry of Defence? How is this resource being coordinated with international partners to secure all the required resources and kit needed for the Ukrainians to defend themselves, and how are they being trained in its use?
I'm in constant contact with my defence counterpart in Ukraine. We talk regularly. The Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary has been incredibly supportive. We're currently at the stage where we have supplied, as I talked about, the anti-tank weapons and other non-lethal equipment. Britain has been side by side with Ukraine since 2014-15, so there's been significant amounts of training and capacity building, and we will continue to look at what other options are available. We have those discussions. Where we can, we meet their demands. Where not, we try and help other people meet it.
Robert Jenrick.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for the leadership that he's shown in recent months? And the paradox is that the more that Putin tries to draw countries towards Moscow, the more he repels them. And the more he revitalises the very alliance that he says he's most afraid of, NATO. But can I ask him specifically on sanctions? Will the UK, when it brings forward its package, ensure that they are synced with those from the United States, include action to prevent UK banks from handling foreign currency transfers from Russian state-owned banks, and include, as I know colleagues in the United States Senate would like to, specific sanctions against Nord Stream 2?
The President of the United States was very clear that he will stop Nord Stream 2. I listened to that press conference like everybody. Also, on the raft of sanctions the government has brought forward, they are intelligently targeted. They build on already existing sanctions after Crimea, but of course we'll continue to keep those measures under review.
Williams.
Speaker, Mr. Putin is actually holding an unscheduled meeting with the Russian Security Council today, which he says in fact will decide on their recognition of the two breakaway republics. What would be the implication for the Minsk protocols of such an eventuality?
Well, I think, as I said to the honourable gentleman from Islington, we do urge both parties to have regard to the Minsk agreement. The Russians only a few weeks ago were saying it should be a Minsk agreement. I think some of those measures go exactly against the Minsk agreement, and perhaps that is a clue to maybe what the real intention is.
Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, when last month I was in Donetsk Oblast with some members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, there was some sniper fire across the line of contact from Russian supporting forces. But what assessment has my right honourable friend made of recent false flag operations in recent days and indeed recent hours?
Shouldn't forget, the Ukrainians have had 10,000 people killed since the invasion of the Donbass. 10,000 people, often weekly or every month, on that line of control. Young men and women who are simply guarding their border. The false flag operations have been growing. I think there is a worrying trend that what we've seen recently fits the bill or the playbook of what we can expect as the Russian government potentially seeks to destabilise and confuse the picture. We're not confused. We know what 160,000 troops mean, and so does the international community.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Maintaining a diplomatic focus is absolutely crucial at this time, but could the government say what diplomatic focus they're bringing to Russian allies across the world? I haven't heard the Defence Secretary talk about that.
Well, the marked difference between Russia is they don't have any allies. Belarus is their only ally. By your friends you shall be judged. Belarus is it. That's one of the problems for Russia. It fails to recognise that international alliances are a sign of both civilised society and human rights. If you want to be on your own and stuff everyone else, you end up like North Korea. We would try and use our allies. We are certainly trying people who have more influence than others, but fundamentally it's going to be in the mind of President Putin what he does next.
Andrew Bridgen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. To what extent does my right honourable friend believe the undignified withdrawal from Afghanistan by ourselves and our allies has emboldened President Putin and contributed to setting in train events that are now unfolding on the Ukraine border?
President Putin wrote his article last July before the Afghanistan withdrawal, so I think that is the biggest symbol of what his ambitions were. But it is absolutely the case that people who don't agree with our values sniff lack of resolve and take action. That's why we have to be resolved.
Margaret Ferrier.
Madam Deputy Speaker, what assessment has the government made of the threat against vulnerable minorities in the Ukraine, such as religious or ethnic minorities or members of the LGBTQ+ community? What discussions has the government had with international allies about preventing widespread human rights abuses in the event of an invasion?
In the event of an invasion, it doesn't matter whether you're a minority or a majority. The Russian government's attitude to those people that disagree with them, either at home or in another country, is woeful and dangerous.
Peter Bone.
Mr. Speaker, with the Russian military action in Transnistria, does the Secretary of State agree that Moldova is also at risk from the Russians, and has there been discussions with their government?
Countries are at risk, often embolden President Putin, which is why one of the reasons we are where we are today is post-2014-2015. Maybe the West was not tough enough on that initial invasion. Moldova, many other countries, smaller countries in NATO, Bosnia-Herzegovina are all causes for concern, and we must therefore recognise that now is not the moment to take the eye off the ball of places far away of which we sometimes know nothing.
Jim Shannon.
Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Secretary of State for his answers to the questions? With the latest news regarding Russian Security Council meetings that invasion is imminent, will the Secretary of State underline what human aid support is available for the ordinary, decent people of Ukraine? What has been done to provide medical supplies for the civilian casualties, which will undoubtedly be high when civilian militias are giving young and old with no weapons training arms to try and save their country?
First of all, I think we should have real admiration for the bravery of many of those people. And if you saw the President of Ukraine's speech at Ukraine, almost a desperate attempt to rally people to be more supportive. A number of countries, including Germany, for example, have supported with field hospitals and medical assistance. That is as important as lethal aid. We will do what we can, and I know many other nations are.
Raymond Shishti.
The stance and leadership the Secretary of State has taken with regards to preserving our international rules-based system. With regards to a specific issue where there is a loophole where Russia gets its money from, under the IMF's SDR, special drawing rights, 650 billion last year were allocated to states around the world. and Russia got $17.5 billion. I and my US counterpart, Congressman Hill from Little Rock, wrote to our respective governments asking them to put conditions to IMF SDR allocations. Will the Secretary of State now relook at that issue so that we can look at all loopholes along with firm sanctions?
My honourable friend, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, is here and will have heard that question. I will be delighted to refer it to the Treasury.
Mr. Speaker, Russia's already clearly mounting an absolutely massive disinformation campaign, especially through social media. Does my right honourable friend agree that it's vital that we and our allies communicate very clearly to Russians, Ukrainians and our own domestic audience that our and NATO's actions are very simple? They're about Ukraine's right to self-determination and sovereignty and essential to maintaining peace in Europe.
It's absolutely about the right to choose. And don't just take it from me, take it from the President of Finland, who made an outstanding speech in New Year's Day about that right.
Jameson. Mr. Speaker, thank you. History's proven that conflict between near-peer or peer adversaries gets very ugly. While I accept that NATO's potential for direct intervention is limited due to Article 5, what planning has been conducted for a possible cross-border refugee and humanitarian catastrophe?
It's incredibly important that NATO seeks to use the extra troops to provide both resilience, reassurance and containment. One of the reasons we have up to 400 Royal Marines in Poland is to assist Poland should a catastrophe happen and huge amounts of refugees pour across the border. I would urge the European Commission to make deep plans about what it's going to do with potentially massive migrant flows in a light of scale we have not seen since the Second World War.
Before we come to the statement on COVID, I would like to point out that the British Sign Language interpretation of proceedings is available to watch on Parliament Live TV. We now come to the statement. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I'll make a statement on our strategy for living with COVID. And before I begin, I know the whole House will join me in sending our best wishes to Her Majesty the Queen for a full and swift